Cemeteries hold far more than remains. They hold stories. And when silence gives way to the unexplainable, that's when true cemetery horror stories are born. Like the one you're about to hear, where a priest stumbles upon a gravestone bearing his own name, and a death date that hasn't come to pass yet. But before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another terrifying tale. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I've always found cemeteries to be strangely peaceful places. It's not just about death, you know. It's about the life that has passed through there, the stories buried along with the bones. But on that day, St. Michael's Cemetery showed me that some stories, well, they aren't quite as dead as they seem. It was a cold morning, the kind where the wind cuts like a knife. I had a funeral to officiate in a few hours, so I decided to take a walk among the tombstones, just to gather my thoughts. The place was empty, just me, the headstones, and that heavy silence only a cemetery has. So far, so normal. Then I saw it. In the oldest corner of the cemetery, where the crosses are crooked and the names are starting to fade from the stone, there was a new tomb, shiny as if it had just arrived. And the worst part? The name on it was mine. Father Mark Silva, born April 12th, 1970. Died on... My blood ran cold. The date of death was 3 days from then. I looked again, rubbed my eyes, even slapped the headstone to see if it was some trick of the light. But no, it was there, written plain as day, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. My heart raced, and that place, which had always seemed so tranquil, suddenly felt full of something. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if the air was heavier, as if something was watching me. Who would pull a prank like this? I thought, trying to find a logical explanation. Parishioner with bad taste? An administrative error? But it didn't make sense. No one knew I would be there that morning. And even if they did, how could they have put up an entire headstone in just a few hours? I took a step back, and that's when things got even weirder. When I blinked, the tomb vanished. Not gradually, not with any effect. 1 second it was there, the next, just emptiness. The grass didn't even look disturbed. I approached again, touched the ground. Nothing. It was as if it had never existed. Now, I'm a priest. I've seen a lot of strange things, heard ghost stories, negative energy, even cases of possession. But nothing prepared me for this. Because that wasn't a ghost. It wasn't just any scare. It was my name, my date, my death. The rest of the day passed like a dream. I officiated the funeral, greeted people, but my mind was back there, on that tomb that appeared and disappeared like a whisper. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of warning? That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the headstone. Died on 3 days. I prayed, asked for a sign, anything that could explain what had happened. But the heavens remained silent. And then, when I finally fell asleep, the nightmare came. I was driving in heavy rain, the car losing control, the headlights of a truck coming toward me. I woke up sweating, my heart pounding so hard I thought I would die right then and there. But I didn't die. At least not that day. And the worst part? The date on the tomb hadn't arrived yet. 3 days. 3 damn days until the date marked on that headstone. I tried to stick to my routine, pretend nothing had happened. But every time I passed near the cemetery, I felt a chill down my spine, as if something was waiting for me there patiently, counting down the hours. On the second day, one of the old men from the parish, Old Tony, pulled me aside after Mass. He had deep-set eyes, a raspy voice, and he said something that made me even more uneasy. "Father, the old cemetery. Sometimes it calls us before our time. I've seen it happen." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean by that, Tony?" He just shook his head, as if he had already said too much. "Some things are better left alone, Father. Some doors weren't meant to be opened." That night, the rain started to fall hard, the kind that seems like it's going to wash the world away. I had to go to the neighboring town to fetch some documents, and despite the bad feeling, I got into the car. The road was winding, visibility almost zero. And then, in the middle of the sharpest curve, I saw it. someone standing in the middle of the road. It was a tall, too thin figure, with arms outstretched as if waiting. I jerked the wheel sharply, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt, and the car flipped. The world turned upside down, glass shattering, metal screeching. When the dust settled, I was hanging upside down, the seatbelt saving me by a thread. Blood was dripping from my face, but I was alive, miraculously alive. And then, I remembered. The date on the tomb was today. I dragged myself out of the wreckage, the cold rain beating on my face, and that's when I heard it. A whisper coming from behind the bushes by the roadside. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. My voice. You escaped? This time. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran until I found help, my heart pounding like a drum. At the hospital, the doctor said I was lucky to be alive, but I knew it wasn't luck. It was a warning. Years have passed, and I've never seen that tomb again. But to this day, when I pass by St. Michael's Cemetery, I feel like something is watching me. Something that isn't done with me yet. Life is fragile, you know? A breath, a chance, and it can all end. And what scares me isn't death. It's knowing that on that day it already knew my name, and that sooner or later it comes back. What a horror. What did you think of the story? What rating from 0 to 10 would you give it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Some things just can't be explained. Seeing your own name engraved on a tombstone is the kind of image that stays in your mind forever. And sometimes what doesn't want to rest comes back. Like in the story you're about to see next, where a tomb, no matter how hard they tried, never stayed closed. Southern France has a way of hiding its dead. It's not just headstones and crosses. It's ancient monuments, statues worn by time, cypress trees whispering with the Mediterranean wind. The Saint-Jean Cemetery was like that, a place where the past wasn't buried, just asleep. And on that autumn afternoon when I saw the Devereux family tomb disturbed for the first time, I knew something had awakened. I was the priest in charge of the cemetery chapel, a simple man, raised in the vineyards of Provence before donning the cassock. I knew every grave, every name carved in stone. But that tomb, in the darkest corner, near the old stone wall, always left me uneasy. The Devereux were an old family, the kind with stories whispered in villages after the third glass of wine. They said the last of them, Edouard, had made pacts with things that shouldn't be named. It was old Claude, the gravedigger, who warned me. "Father, come see this," he called, his voice rougher than usual. The earth around the tomb was strangely soft, as if it had been turned inside out. There were no footprints, no signs of animals. Just that patch of dark soil, almost pulsing. "Some damn vandal," I said, trying to convince myself. But Claude just shook his head, his eyes narrow under his worn-out hat. "It wasn't people, Father. It was him." I didn't need to ask who. We redid the tomb with our own hands, the damp earth sticking under our nails. The next day, it was violated again, this time deeper. And at the bottom of the shallow grave there were marks, 5 parallel grooves, like scratches left by bony fingers trying to escape. I called the village blacksmith, a practical man who didn't believe in ghosts. He covered the tomb with a stone slab and cemented the edges. "Now it will stay quiet," he assured, rubbing his lime-covered hands. But when night fell and I returned to check, the cement was cracked. Not broken, not torn. Cracked as if something had pressed from within. That's when I felt it. That heavy air, full of the smell of wet earth and something more. A sweet odor, like meat left in the sun. The wind stopped. Even the crickets fell silent. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my spine, that something down there was breathing. The next morning, I found the Bishop of Avignon visiting the parish. I told him in a low voice between the chapel's stained glass windows. He remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "There are tombs that are doors, my son, and some doors must remain closed. Now, every night, when the wind blows from the Alpilles, bringing the scent of lavender and sea salt, I refuse to look toward the northwest corner of the cemetery. Because there, Under the cracked stone, something waits, and I don't want to be the man who finds out what happens when it finishes digging. 2 weeks had passed since we covered the Devereaux tomb with cement. The Saint-Jean cemetery seemed to have returned to that deceptive peace, the kind that makes the living think the dead have forgotten them. But I knew. Some things don't end just because you turn your back. It was on a full moon midnight that the silence broke. I was in my room above the sacristy when I heard it, a low, muffled sound as if someone were dragging a stone over the earth. I looked out the window and saw, down there, among the elongated shadows of the crosses, a crouched figure near the Devereaux tomb. I descended the stairs with a lantern, my hands trembling not from fear, but from that sacred anger priests sometimes feel when the inexplicable invades their domain. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing among the cypress trees. Nothing answered. When I got closer, there was no one. Just the stone slab now displaced and the earth around it, disturbed again. But this time there was something different. Footprints. They weren't human footprints. They were too narrow, too long, as if made by bare, twisted bones. And they didn't lead to the tomb. They came out of it, heading toward the old cemetery wall before disappearing. My blood ran cold when I realized whatever was buried there was now out. The next day, I called the only man in the region I knew who dealt with such matters without laughing. Old Bastien, a gypsy who lived on the outskirts of Arles, and whom my grandmother always said had the gift of seeing what others do not. He arrived at the cemetery carrying a bag of herbs and a rosary of little bones I pretended not to notice. Bastien didn't touch the tomb. He didn't need to. He just stopped 3 steps away, closed his eyes, and said, "There are 2 things down there, Father, and one of them doesn't belong to this world." Before I could ask, he knelt down and with a quick gesture, threw a handful of salt on the disturbed ground. The soil hissed. Not metaphorically, a greenish vapor rose from the earth along with a sulfur smell that made my eyes water. "What the hell was that?" I choked. Bastien stood up, suddenly older. "The second warning, Father. The first was when he tried to get out. This was when he showed us he already has. That's when we noticed the stains on the neighboring headstones. Black, sticky marks, as if something had oozed out of the tomb and crawled through the cemetery. And on the ground, half hidden under a dry leaf, a single wilted rose petal, a flower that hadn't grown there for decades. That night, for the first time in years, I locked the church door. And while the village slept under a starry sky, I stayed awake looking out the window, wondering one thing. If Edouard Devereaux was already out of his tomb, what did he want now? 3 nights had passed since Bastien threw salt on the cursed ground. 3 nights in which the cemetery was quieter than usual, a silence of a cornered animal, waiting to pounce. On the 4th night, the church bells began to ring by themselves. I ran to the cemetery with holy water and a crucifix that belonged to the first bishop of Avignon. The moon was red behind the clouds, staining the headstones with blood. And there, in front of the violated Devereaux tomb, stood he. It wasn't a ghost. It was worse, a thing of flesh and bone, but wrong. Edouard Devereaux stood there, his skeleton dressed in rags of what had once been a rich 18th century coat. Between his yellowed teeth, a wilted black rose, and in his empty eye sockets, light. Not a reflection, a pulsating amber light like fire seen through amber. "Father," his voice was the sound of worms crawling in rotten wood. "You should have left the door open." I threw the holy water. It evaporated before touching him, with a hiss that left my ears bleeding. He laughed, and the sound made the roses in the cemetery garden wilt instantly. That's when I saw what was behind him, the open tomb like a stone womb, and inside, oh God, inside was the other thing, a mass of pale, faceless flesh, writhing like a giant fetus, the true body of Edouard still bound to the tomb by the pact he had made. "Centuries waiting," whispered the skeleton as it advanced. "I just needed a priest to complete the ritual." That's when I understood. The tomb had never been violated, it had been prepared. And I, like a fool, had come exactly when he needed. My hand closed on the rosary of bones that Bastian had secretly given me. I threw it between us and the little bones ignited with a bluish light. The skeleton screamed, a sound that made the earth tremble, as the sacred flames consumed its rags. I ran to the tomb and, without thinking, plunged the crucifix into the pulsating mass inside. The entire sky thundered. When I woke up, it was morning. The tomb was intact, the slab in place as if nothing had happened. There were only two pieces of evidence: my burned hands, and on the ground, exactly where the skeleton had stood, a handful of black earth like coal. The bishop transferred me to the north the following month, but to this day, when the wind blows from the south, I hear laughter among the leaves, and sometimes deep down the smell of wilted roses. Weird. When the earth itself seems to refuse a body, it feels like there's something there, something waiting, like in the story coming up next, where a frequent visitor to a cemetery seemed more interested in the living than the dead. The night had already swallowed the sun when I entered the San Lorenzo cemetery. It wasn't my plan to arrive so late, but the traffic in Rome was chaotic, and I needed that. A quiet place, away from the city noise where I could take a deep breath and calm my mind. Cemeteries have always given me a strange sense of peace. I can't explain it. Maybe it was the silence, or the feeling that there, time stood still. The iron gate creaked as I pushed it, and the sound echoed among the ancient tombs. I looked around, checking if there was anyone nearby, but saw no movement. Not a guard, not a visitor. Just me, the full moon, and those centuries-old headstones, some so worn that the names were barely legible. I started walking slowly, running my fingers over the cold stones. Some were cracked with age, others covered in moss. The wind blew softly, making the dry leaves whisper on the ground. I even smiled, thinking how beautifully macabre this place was. But then, I heard it. Someone called my name. It wasn't a shout, not a whisper. It was a clear male voice, as if it were right behind me. Laura. My blood ran cold. I knew there was no one there. I had just looked. My heart raced, but I forced myself to turn slowly, as if afraid of what I might find. And that's when I saw him. A tall, too thin man, standing between two headstones about 10 meters away. He hadn't been there before. I would have noticed. His black overcoat seemed to blend with the darkness, but his face, his face was illuminated by the pale moonlight. Skin white, almost gray, and eyes so dark they looked like holes. He wasn't smiling. He made no expression. He just stared. I didn't think. My body reacted before my brain did. I turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven stones of the path. I didn't look back. I only heard my own steps and my panting breath. When I reached the gate, I almost fell, but managed to hold on and ran straight to my car. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared, and I reversed so quickly that the tires screeched on the asphalt. Before speeding off, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cemetery was quiet again. Nothing moved. No one on the road. No one among the tombs. But I had seen him. I had heard him. And now, just remembering those dark eyes fixed on me made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I didn't know what that was. I just knew it wasn't human. And that, if I were smart, I would never set foot in that cemetery again after nightfall. The car sped down the narrow road and I could barely keep my hands steady on the wheel. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to come out of my throat. I looked in the rearview mirror every 2 seconds, expecting to see that tall, thin figure appearing out of nowhere. But there was only darkness behind me. I stopped the car at a gas station a few kilometers away, just to breathe. My head was a mess. Had I imagined it all? Maybe it was just a night watchman or some villager who decided to take a morbid stroll. But that voice, it had said my name. And that face, there was nothing human in those eyes. I decided to drive around the cemetery, slowly, just to be sure. If it was a real man, I would see him leaving through the gates or walking down the road. I turned on the high beams, lighting up the slender trees and stone walls. Nothing. No movement. It was when I passed in front of the oldest tomb, the one with the broken marble angel, that I felt a chill on the back of my neck. Something made me look to the side, and there he was. The man, standing in the middle of the path, as if he had been waiting for me. This time, closer. Close enough for me to see that he wasn't breathing. His chest didn't rise or fall. And the eyes. God, those eyes seemed to pull the light into them, as if they were made of pure darkness. I stepped on the accelerator hard. The car lurched forward, and when I looked again in the rearview mirror, he was no longer there. But I knew he hadn't just disappeared. He just didn't want to be seen now. I got home, locking all the doors and windows as if that would protect me. I turned on all the lights, took a sip of wine to calm my nerves, but nothing worked. The image of that pale face wouldn't leave my head, because there was something worse. Something I only realized when I lay down and closed my eyes. He wasn't just watching me. He was recognizing me, as if he already knew me from somewhere. And that was much, much worse than any ghost. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face staring at me in the dark. And worse, I started to be sure that I had seen him before. But where? The next morning, I decided to investigate. I returned to the cemetery, but this time during the day with the sun high and people walking through the corridors of headstones. It seemed so normal, so harmless. But I knew that the night transformed that place into something different. I went to the spot where the man had appeared, near the tomb of the broken angel. The nearest headstone was covered in moss, but I cleaned it with my hand and read the name. Lorenzo Bianchi, 1872, 1895. Died at just 23 years old. And below the name, a faded phrase, "Silence is the only answer." An older woman who was tending to a nearby mausoleum saw me staring at the headstone and commented, "That family had a sad story. They say Lorenzo died of love. His fiancée betrayed him, and he hanged himself right there in the cemetery." My blood ran cold. And was he tall? Thin? The woman looked at me strangely. Yes, and he had very dark eyes. Why? I didn't answer. I just thanked her and left quickly, my legs shaking. Because now I remembered. 2 years ago, before moving to Italy, I had a dream. A thin man in a black overcoat calling me by name. At the time, I thought it was just a silly nightmare. But what if it wasn't? What if he had been looking for me ever since? That night, even though I was afraid, I returned to the cemetery. This time, I needed answers. The gate creaked as I entered, and the cold wind cut through my skin. I walked to Lorenzo's tomb, and before I could say anything, I felt a presence behind me. His breath was cold on my neck as he whispered, "You finally came." I turned, and there he was, closer than ever. This time, smiling. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I saw you in my dreams," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They weren't dreams," he replied, his voice as soft as the wind among the headstones. "They were promises." And then, he reached out his hand. Pale, almost transparent. I knew what would happen if I touched it. I knew I would never leave there again. But for a second, I almost accepted. It was the sound of a distant bell that made me step back. I moved away, and he looked away for a fraction of a second, enough for me to run. This time he didn't follow me, but I heard his voice echoing behind me even when I was far away. "One day you'll come back." And the worst? He was right, because since that night, every time I close my eyes I see the cemetery, and him, always there waiting. I never went back to San Lorenzo, but one thing I know, he will find me again. And when that happens, I won't be able to run away again. Creepy, right? Some presences you can just feel, even when you see nothing. But by the time you do see them, it's already too late. In the next story, what starts as a faint, distant cry turns into an encounter no parent could ever forget. But before we move on, if you're still here, it means you're loving these stories. So smash that like button to tell YouTube you're into this kind of content, and never miss another horror tale. The wind cut like a knife that night at Blackwood Cemetery. It wasn't just the cold that weighed heavy in the air, but something more. A negative energy that made your skin crawl before you even realized why. I, Father Callahan, was used to walking among the tombs after sunset. It was an old habit, a way to pray for those who had passed and ensure the place remained at peace. But that night was different. The silence wasn't tranquil. It was suffocating, as if the very air was holding its breath. I followed the stone path, the dim light from my lantern casting shadows that danced among the headstones. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, that for a second I thought it was just the wind whistling through the trees. But it wasn't. It was crying. The cry of a child. My blood ran cold. What on earth would a child be doing in a cemetery at this hour? I looked around, the lantern trembling in my hand. The sound was coming from somewhere to the left, near the oldest section of the cemetery, where the tombs were almost forgotten, covered in moss and roots. I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last, until I reached a small tomb almost hidden beneath wild ivy. The headstone was cracked, the name nearly erased by time, but I could still read it. Lillian Moore, 1892-1898. May the angels lead her. 6 years old. The girl had died at 6 years old, and now, on that cursed night, her crying echoed as if she were right beneath my feet. I knelt down, the damp grass soaking my cassock, and placed my hand on the cold stone. Lord, what is happening here? The crying stopped for an instant as if she had heard me. Then it returned, weaker but still there, a moan of pain, of loneliness. Something inside me shuddered. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a deep sadness, the feeling that this soul had never rested. I made the sign of the cross and began to pray. Not a memorized prayer, but words that came straight from the heart. Lillian, or whoever is here, you are not alone. You have not been forgotten. And then something changed. The air felt lighter, as if an invisible hand had pushed away some of that negative energy. The crying diminished until it disappeared completely. I stayed there, kneeling, not fully understanding what had happened. But one thing I knew, that night had not been normal, and I needed to find out who Lillian Moore was. I stood up, my legs still trembling, and took one last look at the abandoned tomb. Someone had left that child there, not just in the cemetery, but in oblivion. And now, after all this time, she had found a way to be heard. But why? And why now? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Lillian cry alone again. The next morning, with her crying still echoing in my head, I decided to seek answers. Blackwood Cemetery was old, but the records were kept in the church, in dusty books that no one had touched for decades. That's where I found her name again, Lillian Moore. The date confirmed it, 6 years old. But there was nothing more. No relatives, no cause of death. Just that forgotten tomb, and a story no one seemed to know. That's when I remembered Mrs. Davenport. She was over 80 years old and had lived in the house across from the cemetery since she was born. If anyone knew anything about Lillian, it was her. I knocked on the door of that old house, the wood creaking as if complaining about my presence. Mrs. Davenport opened the door slowly, her small eyes full of memories staring at me. Father Callahan. What a surprise. Did you get into some trouble with the dead? She smiled, but there was something in her voice that made me think she already knew why I was there. I explained about the tomb, about the crying, and I saw her face change. She wasn't scared. She was sad. "Ah, the poor thing," she murmured, inviting me in. The house smelled of tea and aged wood, and as I sat in that worn armchair, she began to tell the story. Lillian was an orphan. Her parents died in a shipwreck when she was 4 years old. The family that took her in, well, they weren't good people. The girl didn't live long after that. They say it was illness, but no one knows for sure. All I know is that they buried her in that deep grave and no one ever came to visit. That broke my heart. A child, alone in life and in death. And why did I hear her crying now after all this time? I asked. Mrs. Davenport looked out the window towards the cemetery. Spirits like that, they just want to be remembered, Father. Someone to pray for them, say their name out loud. Maybe you were the first in 100 years to do that. I left there with a heavy heart. I couldn't just leave it at that. I returned to the cemetery before nightfall, this time with a handful of fresh flowers and a white candle. Lillian's tomb was still as abandoned as the night before, but now I knew that there was more than just earth and stone there. There was a story. I knelt again, lit the candle, and placed the flowers on the headstone. "Lillian Moore," I said softly, "you are not forgotten, I remember you." The wind stopped at that moment. No noise, no whisper, just a silence that seemed grateful. And then for a fraction of a second I felt something, a small cold hand touching mine, so quickly it could have been my imagination. But I knew. She had heard me. I stayed there until the candle burned out, until the shadows of the cemetery grew darker. And when I stood up for the first time since that night, I no longer felt that heavy energy. Just a strange peace, as if something had been set right. But I still didn't know if it was the end. Because on the way back, in the corner of my eye, I swore I saw a little girl in a white dress sitting on top of a distant tomb, smiling. And when I turned to look properly, there was nothing there. In the following weeks, I established a routine. Every afternoon before the sun set, I would visit Lillian's tomb. I would bring fresh flowers, light a candle, and talk to her as if she were there, sitting on the edge of the headstone. The cemetery no longer had that heavy energy. Now it just seemed tranquil. Until that different night. I arrived later than usual. The sky was already purple and the first star shone weakly on the horizon. As I approached the tomb, I noticed something strange. All the flowers I had left in the previous days were fresh, as if they had been picked that morning. And in the center of the tomb, resting on the stone, there was a small object that certainly hadn't been there before. A perfect white seashell, the kind you only find by the sea. I knelt down to pick up the seashell, and as I touched it, I felt a gentle warmth, as if it had been heated by the sun. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. On the other side of the tomb, among the lengthening shadows of the evening, there was a silhouette. It wasn't scary, just different. It seemed made of mist and moonlight, with contours that changed softly, like reflections on water. I couldn't make out faces or define shapes, but there was a calm presence, almost familiar. 2 points of silver light shone where the eyes should be, and a voice, or rather something that resembled a voice, echoed soundlessly. "Thank you for taking care of her when we couldn't." The seashell in my hands grew warm for an instant, then cooled. When I looked again at the silhouette, it was dissipating like smoke in the wind. But before it disappeared completely, I saw, or thought I saw, other smaller forms approaching, like children running to embrace someone long awaited. The next day, Lillian's tomb was different. The headstone, once worn by time, now looked new, and beneath her name, in delicate letters that certainly hadn't been there before, it read, "Found the way home." The flowers I left there never wilted. To this day, whenever I pass by that little corner of the cemetery, I smell a faint scent of sea breeze in the air. And sometimes, if the wind is calm, you can almost hear children's laughter. Not sad, not lonely, but joyful, like children playing by the seashore. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be unraveled. Perhaps some stories simply find their ending. And this time, it was a good ending. How scary. What did you think of the story? What rating from 0 to 10 would you give it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. That day didn't seem like any ordinary day. It was a chilly afternoon, and I knew something was off from the moment I set foot in Willow Creek Cemetery. It wasn't just the cold, nor the gray sky that seemed like it wanted to fall on us. It was something more. A heavy energy, as if the air was charged with secrets no one wanted to reveal. I was Father Donovan at the time, and I had conducted more funerals than I could count. This was just another ordinary funeral service. Candles, prayers, words of comfort for those left behind. The family of the deceased was there, crying silently, as I recited the usual words. But it was when I looked back, to the rear of the small group, that I saw her. A woman dressed in black, alone, standing beside an old tomb. Her dress was one of those vintage ones, like from the 1950s, and she wasn't crying, she wasn't praying. She just stood there, staring fixedly at the fresh grave we had just dug. The strangest part? No one else seemed to notice her. I tried not to get distracted, finished the ceremony, but that image wouldn't leave my mind. When the last of the family had gone, I decided to take a walk through the cemetery, just to see if she was still there. And she was, standing in the same spot, now with her eyes fixed on me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a feeling of disconnection, as if she didn't belong there. I approached slowly, trying to appear casual. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" She didn't respond. She just kept staring at me, and that's when I realized the tomb beside her was Eleanor Graves, a woman who had died in 1953. The date was there, clear as day. Eleanor Graves, 1912-1953. Before I could say anything else, the woman in black began to disappear. Not suddenly. No, it was as if she was made of smoke, dissipating into the air piece by piece. In seconds, there was nothing left there, just Eleanor's tomb and that heavy silence, as if the cemetery itself whispered something I wasn't supposed to hear. I ran to the small caretaker's house, an old man named Walter, who had taken care of that place for decades. He was sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe, as if he already knew what I was going to ask. "Ah, so you saw her," he said with a weary smile. "The woman in black appears every year on the same day, always near Eleanor's tomb." "But who is she?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Walter took a slow puff before answering. "They say she was Eleanor's daughter, or maybe Eleanor herself. What I know is that on the night her family died, something happened here, something bad. And since then, she comes back, as if she's waiting for someone." That story didn't make sense. "Died? What do you mean?" "The records say only Eleanor is buried here." The old caretaker looked at the cemetery, where the mist began to form among the tombs. "Ah, Father, sometimes the dead don't just stay underground." And that's when I felt it, that overwhelming sadness, as if decades of crying were trapped in that place. Something terrible had happened there, and I had the feeling that somehow that woman in black was still watching me, even though I could no longer see her. I couldn't get that woman out of my head. In the days following the funeral, I returned to the cemetery more times than I'd like to admit, always in the late afternoon, when the sun began to hide and the shadows grew longer. Walter, the caretaker, looked at me with a mix of pity and curiosity, as if he knew I wasn't going to give up so easily. A week later, I decided to investigate on my own. I went to the parish archives, rummaging through old records until I found what I was looking for: the story of Eleanor Graves. She hadn't died of natural causes, nor had her family. According to the yellow documents, Eleanor, her husband, and their young daughter had disappeared one autumn night in 1953. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that weeks later, their bodies were found inside their own tomb, as if they had been buried alive. The case was hushed up. The newspapers of the time only mentioned a domestic tragedy, and the cemetery was marked by that secret. But what made my hair stand on end was a note at the end of the report, handwritten by a priest of the time: "She will return until the truth is told." That night I returned to the cemetery, determined to understand what was happening. The wind howled among the headstones, and the mist descended like a veil over the tombs. I went to Eleanor's and, for the first time, noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small iron cross, buried upside down behind the headstone. A symbol of desecration. Someone had cursed that grave. That's when I felt it, that presence again. The woman in black was behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know. I felt her cold, that chill that didn't come from the wind, but from something much older. When I finally had the courage to look, she was closer than before, her pale face illuminated by the faint light of the moon. This time, she spoke. They lied. Her voice was a hoarse whisper as if it came from far away. My name is not here. My blood was not washed away. And then, as if the ground had life, I saw hands coming out of the earth around the tomb. Skeletal hands, pulling, scratching, trying to free themselves. The air grew heavy, full of muffled moans, and I realized it wasn't just Eleanor who was trapped there. It was her whole family. Walter appeared suddenly, holding a lantern, his face tense. "Father, you shouldn't be here at night." "What happened to them, Walter?" I shouted as the ghostly hands writhed on the ground. The old caretaker looked at the tomb, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Her husband, he did something terrible, something not even death erased, and now they can't rest. The woman in black, Eleanor, advanced towards us, and the world around us seemed to fold, as if the entire cemetery was sinking into its own pain. That's when I realized the truth. She didn't want to scare anyone. She wanted justice, and if I didn't tell their story, she would never leave. The rest? Well, that's a story for another night. But if you ever pass by Willow Creek Cemetery and see a woman in black near an old tomb, run, because not all the dead are at peace. And some secrets, well, weren't meant to stay buried. Some things leave a mark on you, the kind you can't shake. That last story left me with that eerie feeling, like some presences never really left. If you've made it this far, you already know these stories aren't for the faint of heart. So comment "Haunted Cemetery" below, just so I know you stuck with me till the end. If you're into this darker kind of content, hit that subscribe button. There's always room for one more story, the kind no one dares to tell. And if these tales gave you chills, or made you stop and think, leave a like. It shows the connection was real. There's a video right over here that'll keep the vibe going. Click it and join me there.